Now, some think that the opium trade really kicked off in Afghanistan when the war happened. This is true, but it's the wrong war. It was during the Soviet times, the Afghan-Soviet conflict right through the 80s. That's when the opium trade started booming. And in fact, the Taliban themselves, when they were in power, before they were overthrown back in 2001, pretty much helped, they encouraged the opium trade. They did. They encouraged it. They were cool with it. Okay. Give you a little bit of history on the old heroin trade, so we can have an idea about, whether you should still be doing your heroin now, or whether you should give it up for moral purposes. A bit of other history. You see, Afghanistan years and years ago was a kingdom, and it had a Shah, similar to Iran. It was actually quite a progressive nation, believe it or not. A lot of nations in that area were quite progressive until hardline Islam took over and said ladies have to cover their ankles or they chop their heads off, that kind of thing. So the Americans helped out the Shah of Afghanistan way back in the 50s. And he wanted to turn it into an economic superpower sort of type situation. And he wanted to build dams. Okay. He wanted to irrigate the land, and he wanted to build dams and whatever dams do, So the Americans helped him build dams. Now, inadvertently, what happened? Poppy seeds are weird because they lie dormant for a very long time. Like a poppy seed you can have a poppy seed for about 100 years, and as soon as you cultivate it, it will start growing, and it grows like wildfire. That's what happened after the First World War, when they dug up all the land and you got the massive fields of poppies. Because the seeds had just been lying there dormant, waiting for someone to stir it up. So the same thing happened in Afghanistan. See, what happened when they built the dams was it flooded the land, and it propagated poppies, and inadvertently helped the cultivation of poppies. It's so from trying to make this country a progressive nation with lots of dams and water systems, they encouraged the growth of the poppy flowers that are now part of, account for the largest amount of heroin sold in the world. Isn't that fascinating? See, it was just one of those accidents. Life happens like that. So, this is fascinating. So, in the 80s, I got notes. During the Soviet-Afghanistan war, basically what the CIA did, because they used that as a proxy war to cripple the Soviet Union, and it was kind of part of its downfall, but not really. Some would argue that it wasn't, but it was like the final last gasp of the Soviet Union, and the and the CIA funded a lot of the resistance fighters to fight against them. Now, what happened was, I think on the Pakistan border, it was a very lawless land where anything goes. And the CIA pretty much looked the other way because they knew that the people that they were helping fight the Soviets were selling heroin, selling opium to fund their wars. Okay. So, during the 70s, they produced about, it says here, 100 tons a year. Now, by 1991, at the end of the Afghanistan conflict between them and the Soviet Union, they were producing 2,000 tons a year. Again, it was the CIA. Okay, not directly, but again, once again, indirectly, like with the crack pandemic in LA, the CIA, with their whole ethos of just sort of looking the other way when it suits them, was responsible for a massive boom in drug consumption. So when the Taliban took over in 1996, they encouraged opium cultivation because they didn't have much else going. Because basically the Taliban turned Afghanistan into a shithole country. It's now the 6th poorest country in the world. And that's not just because of the war. Like, the Taliban pretty much helped that happen because, like, under those sort of regimes, what do you get done? Nothing great. And everyone doesn't want to do business with you because you're nutters. They're like, well, we don't really want to trade with you. Except the Chinese. They'll trade with any motherfucker, as you will see over the next few years. So by the end of the 90s, Afghanistan actually accounted for like 75% of the world's heroin production. It was 75% of the world's opium production, which basically means 75% of the world's heroin was coming from Afghanistan. But in July 2000, okay, they suffered a couple of years of droughts, and there was a lot of starvation going on. And the Taliban actually banned opium production. That's when they banned it. Because apparently they were trying to appeal to the world community. Because obviously there's like this rogue nation, and they're happy with everyone producing heroin, and heroin is like, not cool in most countries. So they try to appeal to the world community to help them out. But obviously when you appeal to the world community to help you out, you have to make some changes. There has to be a deal done. So when the UN went in, now the UN apparently surveyed just over 10,000 villages, and they actually found that opium harvest had reduced by 94%. So they had done what they said they were doing. But in turn, that pretty much crippled the Afghan economy, and they were on the brink of absolute collapse. Okay, absolute collapse. So and then not too long after that, the war happens. Now, during the Afghanistan war that we know of, that started in 2001, the CIA again were funding warlords and helping warlords fight the Taliban. And once again, they turned a little blind eye to the warlords growing opium and selling heroin. And perhaps they helped them do it. Who knows? So by 2008, Afghanistan was producing about 8,200 tons of opium. And then at that point, it accounted for 93% of the world's heroin supply. 93%. Now, apparently, I remember reading figures years ago during that time that it was about almost 30 to 40%, maybe that's a bit high, of the GDP of Afghanistan was from opium at that point. Because, let's face it, they weren't doing much else. Okay. But what happened was the Taliban started taxing local drug traffickers as well. They were making money off it too. They weren't just growing it. Whether they were growing it or not, you have to look into it. But they were taxing. And they were making hundreds of millions of dollars just by taxing. They didn't have to grow it. They didn't have to smuggle it. Just gangstering it. Coming in, we know you're making a lot of money. We're going to have to put a little tax on that. Now, they built up enough cash to buy weapons. Okay. And also to recruit fighters. Now, a fighter that the Taliban recruited would be earning about $300 a month, it says, which is way more than your average farmer would have earned in Afghanistan. Don't forget, this is the 6th poorest country in the world. I don't know what a farmer would earn there, but it would be nowhere near $300 a month. Like, countries in Asia that are doing way better than Afghanistan, $300 a month would be actually a good wage. Do you know what I'm saying? So, by 2017, now they did go through a period, I should say, where they were fighting hard against the heroin trade, and they did manage to sort of reduce it by half. But then that all went tits up because the Taliban were getting involved too much, and production went on to reach the all-time high of 9,000 tons a year. Okay, and 60% of the Taliban's funds for wages and weapons came through the opium trade. Okay, and around about that time, the trade was worth between $4.6 and $6.6 billion. That was in 2017. Okay. So, now, it still makes up quite a significant percentage of the GDP. I think it goes up to like... oh, shit. Will I cut that bit? I don't know. You're still talking somewhere, I think, like 11% of the GDP, 11 to 9 to 13%, something like that, of the GDP comes from opium still. Now, considering, because I don't think a lot of people realize that the Taliban were well into growing opium before it became, it's like a reposition, before it became a better idea to, stop harvesting it when they needed help. But now, I mean, you're talking in Afghanistan, like 2.5 million people, 2.5 to 3 million people are addicted to heroin, addicted to opium. They do have their own drug problems there too. Now, these are things that they're gonna have to address. But what happens to the heroin trade now? Because it's been booming during the war times. But I was thinking, is it going to reduce now? Because the Taliban are like, well, no to drugs, no to drugs. But it turns out they weren't, because they kind of need it. So it's going to be very interesting to see what they do about all the heroin.